What's up, guys? Thanks so much for checking out the channel today, and of course, if you're an SPQR fan, this will be hopefully a good one for you. So we're going to create a top 10 list here, basically factions that are missing from the game currently, or things that we would like to see at some point. Now, of course, there's many others that we're kind of leaving off here, but just these are sort of 10 that just kind of came to mind. And some are certainly, as we get toward the top of the list, would of course be sort of more obvious and glaring omissions from the game currently. Anyway, so we're going to break down the list for you real quick in the intro here, and then we're going to spend some time on each faction, starting with the number 10 spot, which will be the Jewish Revolt era type of list for that particular period there. Number 9 will be Thrace, 8 Syracuse, 7 the Seleucids, 6 the Illyrians, 5 the Etruscans, 4 Ptolemaic Egypt, 3 Pyrrhus and Epirus, so basically the sort of Macedonian successors, or one of the Macedonian successors, but like as Macedonia itself. 2 the Samnites, and then number 1, you may have guessed it already, but will be Carthage. So we're going to look at each of those in turn, so it's going to be a longer video as we talk about each faction briefly and what it could offer the game. So stay tuned for you guys, and we will go through all of that. Alright guys, so starting off in the 10 spot here is going to be what we're just calling sort of the Jewish Revolt faction, but you have to come up with a better name for it. But just you know, that particular period there, which doesn't cover a lot of time compared to some of the other factions that are available, but nonetheless could offer a little interesting group here. So it wouldn't make sense to have these guys be mercenaries, but as a faction itself, so this would essentially be pretty much all infantry focused, but could offer some really special like ambush type of rules and other things like that. So certainly wouldn't necessarily be an elite list, but I think it could overall offer some interesting skirmishing type options there, as far as, again, a lot of harassment type of units. So, you know, your typical slingers, javelins, all that fun stuff, mixed with some sort of hit and run tactic type of infantry lists, and certainly like some sort of ambushing rules there. And again, if an expansion were to add new talents and things like that, it'd be interesting to, of course, sort of gear heroes towards that. So that could certainly be an interesting one. And scenarios could really reflect that too, and would be a great matchup for you know, the Romans to deal with as well. So that's just starting off in our 10 spot there. Again, it wouldn't necessarily be a diverse list, and essentially Warlord already makes most of those type of models, although again, they would probably port some of those over into that new resin and could potentially offer like a new kit or something too, but certainly maybe like some hero models would be interesting there. But again, overall wouldn't be like a large or diverse faction, so that's why it's in the 10th spot. Alright guys, coming in at number 9 is Thrace, and we already have these guys as mercenary options at the end of the book, so just their own separate mercenary entry, so they're not necessarily existing factions in that sense, like some of the other lists can borrow from, like, you know, let's say Gaul can borrow from Germania and vice versa and so on. But, you know, we already have 2 unit options there as like true mercenary options, so it would maybe make sense to expand these guys into a faction. And again, it wouldn't be a hugely diverse faction, so that's why they're towards the bottom of the list here, but would still present some interesting options. So we kind of got some rough familiarity in the sense of them being loosely into that sort of Greek, ancient Greek and Roman sphere of influence, so there would be some similarities there, but while still maintaining maybe more of that tribal type of list or feel that the like Gauls, Germans, and Brits would offer there. So it could be some interesting options there. On the infantry side, don't necessarily know too much about what cavalry forces would be available there, but that could still be an interesting incorporation. But again, overall not the largest unit type of selection, but again would also be an interesting opportunity to add some heroes there, so like Mithridates, but also Spartacus before being a gladiator and stuff like that. Could be just a couple of interesting possibilities there. But again, somewhat like the Jewish Revolt list there, could offer certainly a lot of warband type of lists focused again on numbers, but with a little bit of a hint of, again, the influences or contact with the Greeks throughout history as well there, and of course the Romans. So again, it would be an interesting list to see, and just you know, geographically kind of sitting on sort of the eastern part of where Rome is, but not quite, you know, as far east as like the Dacians and stuff like that, or Sarmatians. So again, just an interesting list that could offer some new models and new tactics there, while being, I think, overall just a little bit more militarily viable and a larger skill. With a little bit longer history, of course, in that sense, than like what the Jewish Revolt would offer, which is just a very small, relatively small period of time, of course. So, and again, offering some options there in the hero side, which we currently wouldn't or don't have any kind of access to. So, anyway, so that would be Thrace sitting at number 9 spot. So basically just taking them from a pure mercenary faction and kind of expanding upon some of the units and things that they could do there, which wouldn't be overly difficult for warlords to achieve. All right, guys, coming in at number 8 is Syracuse. So yet another sort of Greek offshoot here, and obviously, if you're not quite familiar with Syracuse and the history there, so definitely look that up. But I'm assuming if you're watching this video, you probably already are. But again, another city-state, and kind of gets us away from that sort of typical Athens, Sparta, and Thebes vibe that you pretty much, those are like the poster boys of the Greek lists that are available. But Syracuse does have a list in Hail Caesar, which would be cool to see it then sort of ported over here, but with maybe some options to explore other areas that the Hail Caesar list doesn't offer necessarily, doesn't stray too far from sort of that template of Greek forces. But again, would offer some interesting things there. So also just considering its location. So, but certainly on the hero side, we could offer things like Archimedes, for example, and some of the other leaders there. But on the Archimedes side, it could might if it doesn't stray too far from the actual historical facts, but just offer some interesting, like a way to incorporate his various inventions and stuff into potential either scenarios or the actual forces of Syracuse that the war or the list here would offer. But again, pretty much typical Greek units. We could maybe add some local inspired things or certainly allies there, and again that could come into play too at various points with some of the other things on the list, like sort of being right in the middle between Carthage and Rome as well. But yeah, just be interesting to see stuff like that. And again, essentially the models already exist, right? Because it would essentially be using things that Warlord already has for the Greeks. So it would basically just sort of repackage the hoplites and maybe add a few other things here, just to again make the flavor a little bit more different than the typical like Athens or Thebes or Sparta list, but nonetheless would be an easy one to do. It would introduce a new faction with maybe a different focus, and again, depending on how easy it would be to maybe incorporate some of those inventions of Archimedes or something like that. But scenarios certainly could be centered around sort of defending the city itself and things like that. But overall would be an interesting and easy faction to incorporate. We just have to decide on basically not making it a carbon copy of the other Greek lists, and I think that could be achievable with some minor tweaks. But let me know what you guys think on that. Anyway, that's why we put Syracuse at 8. Again, nothing necessarily greatly new here, but nonetheless I think would be a worthy inclusion with maybe some interesting quirks, let's put it that way, that it could offer the game. Alright guys, and now we're moving on to number 7, which would be the Seleucids. And basically, historically, of course, right, one of the successors to Alexander's empire, and in many ways could really combine the influences of Macedon with sort of a combination of what the Persian Empire had troop-wise as well. So again, would be very interesting to see there, and just offers an interesting combination of those things there in the roughly 300 years or so that the empire existed. And territorial-wise, it was sort of the largest of Alexander's successors. Basically, most of the former Persian Empire's land before it got further broken up in various ways. So, but you can certainly have its initial founder Seleucus I, but also Antiochus III and Mithridates I of Parthia, if you wanted to kind of include that in that sense. But that could really, Parthia would be maybe a separate faction down the road. But so you could certainly have interesting things to incorporate there, and again, sort of a way of showing that sort of Hellenistic influence on what was formerly essentially Persia by and large. And of course would set up some interesting sort of rivalries with some of the other things on our list here, like Ptolemaic Egypt and basically the other successors to Alexander. So again, this would be, I think, one of the larger factions, and again would still be easily achievable just because you have, in its brief history, of course, all the infighting between Alexander's successors, but then also eventually dealing with Rome and so on and so forth. But even on its eastern borders, of course, where that sort of fragmented more into some other successor kingdoms, there's a lot of possibility there. But model-wise, it would certainly be one of the larger factions to introduce, except for the fact, of course, that it also already has those models. So in that sense, it would be, again, easy on Warlord's part to be able to do that. So again, hero-wise, we have some clear heroes that we could certainly offer there. And then model-wise would be, again, sort of a hybrid between Macedonian and Persian lists in many ways, with maybe a few new wrinkles thrown in there as well. And would certainly, again, lend itself to some interesting scenarios. And a lot of these scenarios of the successor kingdoms could really be taking a different route, where it's playing up that sort of ever-shifting web of alliances and betrayals and infighting between all of them, which could really be interesting there. And even though, again, the Seleucids had that large territory and all that, but in many ways also kind of caught in the middle of all the other successor kingdoms there. So again, would be an interesting list overall, and that's why we move it up to 7. And again, all the models already exist, essentially, barring a few minor modifications that I'm sure could be achieved either with maybe like a new kit or just some careful modification or painting and other things like that. But yeah, definitely could be an interesting one there. Alright guys, coming in next are the Illyrians, which offer us an interesting army to or faction to expand the game with, in the form of a list, or peoples that definitely has a long history, but not always, or not as much as known, just because of the lack of original records, I guess. So a lot of what we know comes from the Romans and the Greeks as it relates to them, and in many ways they were a thorn in the side for both, for various parts of history, but certainly offer some interesting play styles there. So we could add Bardillus or Agron as heroes there, just as some of the more notable leaders of the various peoples. They weren't necessarily a unified people by any way, shape, or form, so there could be maybe some tribal rules that get offered there to sort of differentiate between the various groups of the Illyrians. So again, not a unified people, but that could be reflected in the list too. And again, in many ways, they were always known as very highly capable fighters, if not always loyal as mercenaries. But in that sense, again, showing some influences from taking from the Greeks and using some of their armor and equipment to other influences there, just from the peoples that they had contact with, but and sort of trying out some of the tactics and so on that they saw other peoples using. But that being said, in many ways would be probably more, again, sort of a raiding style list with maybe a little bit of sort of that horde influence that some of the other factions like the Gauls and Greeks, or not Greeks, but Germans would be employing. So numbers game certainly, but then sort of maybe having a clear difference between sort of your average fighters to the more wealthier leaders and kings of various tribes and stuff like that, who would have access to the best of the best equipment. Speaking of equipment, so apparently they had a special type of curved sword called the Sika, which would be interesting to incorporate. So in some ways, you can see some rough similarities there with the Dacians, but again, slightly different time periods there. But also making use of other things like sort of trying rough phalanx type setups, although that doesn't really work as much in SPQR. You can still form that kind of formation, but there should be maybe some penalties there, since they didn't quite master it as well as the Greeks. But in many ways, they had successes over the Greeks as well, with some of their formations and other tactics that they adapted. But so kind of taking some things again from the Greeks without necessarily making some of the mistakes that the Greeks maybe made during those times. But on the equipment side too, so various spears, axes, and other things could be incorporated, javelins and stuff as well. Of course, the ubiquitous javelin for many people. So in many ways, again, kind of a list here that could show some influences basically on where they were at geographically and historically. So for a long time dealing with the Greeks, but then also, again, some of their mercenary expeditions and things like that. So certainly would be worthy, if nothing else, as more mercenary options there in future expansions for the game. But I think in some ways they could deserve at least sort of their own faction with, again, not necessarily maybe a horribly, or not sorry, horribly, but a hugely diverse list, but again, could certainly offer some interesting infantry options there with, again, maybe some access to a little bit of cavalry and so on. But certainly shouldn't be an overpowered list, but their sort of internal fighting, never sort of unifying as like one big people, could also be incorporated into sort of maybe a sort of a factional rule for them where they maybe some sort of like leadership penalties or things like that, or just ways where certain things become a little bit more unreliable. And again, depending on if the game adds new talent trees for heroes and stuff like that, that could show up there in some ways. But again, using some of those named heroes there that we talked about, like Agron and Bardillus, could certainly offer some interesting things there as ways to sort of interact and sort of some of their more successful periods as well. So overall, again, another one I think that deserves some work, but there's certainly others that are more deserving. But model-wise, again, wouldn't necessarily be all that difficult. Again, I don't think Warlord makes anything specifically Illyrian off the top of my head, but I think a couple other companies do. But if worst case, that could also be a job of kit bashing and stuff like that. But for now, I would say certainly more, at least mercenary options, but then with a goal or a look of getting these guys to maybe a full faction at some point. But it would require a little bit of research, and again, some of it would be kind of relying on third-person or third-party sources, since we don't have too much first-hand information on the Illyrians. So let us know what you guys think on that. Alright guys, moving into the next spot, we have the Etruscans, and this one, again, would probably require some new model kits here to really fully represent that, although, again, some creative kit bashing could work there as well, since we don't really know or have as many examples of what the Etruscans would have looked like, or militarily, as we do, of course, Rome and Greece and so on and so forth. But, again, could be an interesting expansion there, just to sort of more fully populate sort of the ancient world here, because Warlord certainly loves basically just anything ancient's released is always seemingly focused on Rome and Gaul, as if that's like the only thing that existed, when obviously that's not the case. So in that sense, it would be nice to start filling in some of the other classical enemies of Rome, if nothing else, just to, again, offer more interesting options there. So militarily, of course, again, we would see a lot of similarities, but again, sort of as allies at various times and enemies. But you have the interactions between the Etruscans and Carthage, some of the Greek influences in Italy, especially Syracuse and other allied Greek cities. And the Etruscans, the invasion, the Gallic invasion of northern Italy, that also helped weaken the Etruscans. So there's lots of interesting things that could be offered there, and sort of as a sort of mirror image or different version. Not I shouldn't say different version, but sort of a different version of Italy, and not just sort of that typical Roman thing that we see as far as painting and hobby and all that goes. So. So again, just some differences there, and in many ways showing some of the similar types of units that the Romans could field, but obviously just would require some actual dedication towards sort of a new line of models, more or less. But and again, sort of lack of detailed information would probably be a little bit of a issue there. But I think Etruscans could offer an interesting faction that we don't currently have, just as another sort of enemy of Rome, essentially. And again, sort of filling in that that picture, that ancient picture here of it wasn't just Rome, since that's essentially all we get as far as releases go. So I think that should be looked at some point. Might not be the easiest faction to sort of bring to life, but again, there could be a little bit of creative liberty there to show that, and overall probably shouldn't be necessarily all that powerful of a faction, but something that could certainly offer up some interesting counterpoints to what Rome offers as far as, again, the hobby and the game itself is concerned. So, equipment-wise, again, I think there were certainly some influences there from the larger Mediterranean world, but again, they also influenced the Romans to some degree as well. So there could be some interesting ways to sort of depict that and bring that to life in the game. So mercenary-wise, probably wouldn't make too much sense for them, but I think at some point they should sort of get a bit of a faction and a little bit more attention, so it's not just, again, all Rome on the Italian peninsula, which one of our other lists here, or other suggestions, will bring that into a little bit more clearer focus in the form of the Samnites, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. But nonetheless, I think Etruscans could offer some things for the game there. Alright guys, we move on to Ptolemaic Egypt, and this is another easy one that could be added to the game just to sort of, on the one hand, fill out some of the successor states to Alexander, which in some ways makes it easy on the model side, where it's maybe just sort of repackaging the existing forces that are out there, but also offers a chance to really field something interesting, sort of a mix between Egypt at the time, but then also, or what was left of Egypt essentially, and then sort of as the Macedonians and the Greeks essentially took over there, and then Hellenized it, and what that army essentially turned into over the 3 or so centuries of Greek influence over Egypt. So certainly would see a lot of, again, the influences of sort of the Macedonian army, but again, could also incorporate some of the available Egyptian forces, whatever those may have been, and offer sort of an interesting take between the two. And it would, again, be a nice counterpoint between them and the other successors like the Seleucids, but more later on, sort of that position that Egypt was put into as the Roman Republic was falling apart, essentially. So, obviously Ptolemy could be in there and some of his successors, but then, and maybe Cleopatra as well, even though she wasn't necessarily a frontline fighter in any way, shape, or form, but nonetheless could make for an interesting special character that maybe would affect, in the form of the special rules, maybe have some other interesting game effects that could be used there as well. And certainly, as basically Egypt kind of met its end there at the hand of the Romans, could offer some interesting hybrid possibilities there as well, which we haven't really seen in the game yet, but maybe, depending on if you're taking a special hero or not, that could either limit or restrict some of the unit options that are available, or make others available in certain numbers too. So that could be an interesting concept to explore with this list. But Ptolemaic Egypt, nonetheless, could be something interesting, and again offer a little variation. So not just another Greek list, not just another Macedonian offshoot, but sort of an interesting cultural mix there. And again, scenario-wise, could offer very broad things, whether it's, again, the various wars between the successors of Alexander to sort of where they end up with Romans ultimately. So another interesting one there. And again, model-wise, wouldn't necessarily require too much, although depending on what actual Egyptian forces would be available and how that was incorporated, that might require some of the other existing things to either be upgraded or some new kits as well. But overall, I think it could be another interesting addition to the game at some point. Alright guys, next on our list is Pyrrhus, which again would be another Macedonian successor, and really would, as far as timeline goes, be a very brief period of history, really, just for his lifetime. But again, we could maybe expand this to sort of the successor Macedonian kingdoms, or just what Macedon and the Greek world was after passing of Alexander. So could be an interesting sort of continuation of the Macedonian list that currently is in the book, but with maybe some influences there, just as far as representing some of the slight changes that successive rulers made, basically until Macedon was finally conquered in Greece by the Romans. So in that sense, we could maybe expand that to there and not just have Pyrrhus that brief period of his rule be the sole focus of the faction. And in that sense, would open up some other heroes there, where Pyrrhus could certainly have an interesting special rule to sort of represent him winning, but sort of at the cost of horrible losses as well. So, but that would be, I think, probably the best route to overall go with the faction there. So, in that sense, again, some clear continuation from the Macedonian list, but with other influences there, and maybe a reorganizing of the way that the Greeks continue to fight, where the hoplite and the typical Macedonian pike phalanx kind of moved towards more Thoricatae and Thuriophori becoming more common. So maybe just changing around the way the Macedonian list worked, but also leaving off some things that wouldn't really make sense so much anymore, like maybe the war elephants and so on. Don't believe they had that much access to that anymore after Alexander's passing and all that. But again, would really also again help expand that sort of the wars of the Diadochi, or Dochi, depending on how you pronounce that, but just various times being allies and enemies as they kind of battled for the remains of Alexander's empire. But I think that would sort of offer, again, an interesting list and sort of more of a continuation that would make sense then with fighting some of the other battles against Rome and so on, and some other, what-if scenarios there. So scenario-wise could certainly reflect Macedon and so on, trying to still exert influence and maybe their sort of efforts to curb Rome's rise during the remainder of the 3rd century and so on, until they eventually just were conquered by the Romans. But also some of the sort of just battles for what was left of Greece, essentially, or the Greek city-states after Alexander. So again, just that sort of interconnected web between all these different factions vying for control or supremacy in the wake of Alexander's death. But yeah, model-wise, again, this would be a no-brainer. Pretty much everything already exists. It would just be a matter of, I think, tweaking some things slightly, and by and large, this would be just some repackaging with maybe, ideally just maybe at least like new hero sculpts and things like that, just to represent some of the other named heroes that would be in the faction, and or just some more generic looking Greek heroes. But again, that would be an interesting one to go for, and would be easy, I think, overall to incorporate for Warlord. Alrighty, guys, clocking in at number 2 are the Samnites, which again, they do have a list. Excuse me, they do have a list in Hail Caesar, so this would be an easy one, ideally, I think, to port over into SPQR, and certainly worthy of it, as they were a very real threat to the Romans for a period of time, and certainly between them and the Etruscans, and then various Greek incursions into Italy and colonies, certainly paint a more complicated picture than just, again, the typical packaging that were offered as far as like Warlord is giving us here, is where it's like always Rome and Gaul together, right? There's just so much more, I think, to that period of history, which would also help shed a little bit more light on these factions overall. And I think, again, they're certainly worthy of inclusion. So the Samnites don't really have any existing models from Warlord, although, again, kit mashing wouldn't make that overly difficult to achieve. But there's one where I do believe Victrix has some very gorgeous Samnite models, so that would be certainly valuable there. But, there's a whole period of Samnite wars that the Romans fought, and various uprisings and rebellions before Rome kind of firmly stamped out any and all opposition in the Italian peninsula. So in that sense, certainly worthy there. And I do believe at one point the Samnites and whatever was left of the Etruscans also tried to ally together. Maybe it was Gauls. I cannot remember off the top of my head. But again, certainly not a case where just Rome has always dominated the Italian peninsula, and certainly in the period that the game covers still. So that being said, the Samnites would in many ways offer some similar unit types to the Romans. Obviously not really the phalanxes or anything like that. But this was still where I think Rome was fighting more the manipular setup with their armies. So, but again, just equipment-wise, there could be, I think, some rough similarities. Although, again, certainly skill and training, organization would be obviously unlike the Roman side, but nonetheless, Samnites were certainly high-quality fighters, and at various times, obviously, beat up on the Romans. Although, obviously, never conquered them entirely, but certainly gave the Romans trouble. Heroes there we could have, if these are accurate, Gaius Pontius and Gellius Ignatius. So probably not names that are familiar to most people, but those I believe are at least listed as some known leaders of the Samnites there. But again, just depends on what, I guess, a real faction for them in the game would look like. Hero-wise scenarios certainly would, I think, be almost entirely focused on, dealing with the Romans and sort of the various parts of the Samnite Wars. So in that sense, that would make sense there. And in that sense as well, faction-wise, again, pretty much probably entirely infantry-based, but and again, sort of a presenting sort of a not exact mirror image of the Romans, but sort of a opposite side of the coin, where there'd still be some rough influences and similarities, but some clear differences there. So probably overall lighter, more mobile force in that sense, with more of a skirmishing feel there, but maybe not necessarily the sort of full-on horde warband tribal flavor that like the Gauls and the Germans would probably be bringing in the game. So just some differences there, but again, that would take a little bit of fleshing out, but overall wouldn't be all that complicated, and again, certainly would be worthy of inclusion there. So certainly, again, something that would at least be another interesting opponent, especially at least for the Republican Roman list and other contemporary ones that represent that time in SPQR. All right, guys, before we get to number one, and really this could certainly be on the list proper, but I feel like this almost deserves a separate video entirely. Again, certainly a worthy faction. It would just be an interesting couple of decisions I think that would have to be made to incorporate this properly, but that would be basically somehow representing the various servile wars that Rome had, and or the gladiators, specifically more the revolt of Spartacus. So if you don't know the servile wars, again, one of Rome's many wars, but basically slave uprisings essentially. The first two mainly focused in Sicily, with some interesting heroes available there, but then obviously the last one really dealing with Spartacus, and if you're already watching this video, you should probably know who that was and be familiar with what that list would probably look like. But, if we're focusing more on Spartacus and the gladiators, obviously Spartacus, Crixus, and so on would be clear heroes there. And, an interesting tie-in there, just as maybe like special edition models. Again, Warlord could try and get the sculpts to look like the actors from the more recent TV show, but still offering maybe just more regular ones as well. But overall, again, like a gladiator-themed list would be really interesting, because you could certainly have very elite fighters like that are almost like the heroes, right? Would be the gladiators, but even maybe having like a lower-level gladiator type of unit that could just have all kinds of crazy and wacky equipment and armor, arms and armor combinations, which would certainly, I think, be interesting to put up against the Romans and so on. And tactics-wise, again, maybe leadership wouldn't necessarily be the best, but again, there's just lots of different possibilities there. So that should be almost like a infinitely customizable unit. And again, that could really be nice to represent that with an awesome new kit as well. But the leaders, like one-on-one, so like Spartacus and so on, Crixus should be just absolute badass heroes in the game. So certainly you should chew through lesser generic heroes and even some of the named heroes, and certainly just individual generic units and stuff like that. The rest of the list would be various levels of quality. Spartacus was able to outfit a lot of his forces with actual Roman gear from the many Roman forces that they destroyed that were sent to get them. But there should also be sort of like a low tier one where it's basically like not quite cannon fodder, but units that are just very lightly or ill-equipped, but maybe have some sort of scavenging rule where if they do survive a combat and break an enemy unit, they can then upgrade themselves mid-battle or something like that. That could be really interesting to incorporate, or it could even be like some of the new talents or something maybe that we could add for that faction, or special hero rules or something as well. So yeah, so definitely some different tiers I think there. I don't think by and large, if I remember correctly, that they were able to capture too many cavalry or anything from the Romans, but again, infantry horde here, but with, again, sort of elite gladiator tier, sort of average gladiator or former slaves or whatever that had military experience, and then kind of more the low-end hordes that weren't able to be properly equipped or as trained or disciplined as the upper level guys. So that could be interesting there. From the earlier servile wars, again being mainly focused in Sicily, so a couple of different the leaders of those two would be obvious hero choices there, and again similar somewhat to what we just talked about for like a Spartacus themed list. You'd have the different levels of quality, and then very quickly on down to those who just weren't well trained or had access to any of the equipment that that some of the other forces there were able to steal off of the various Roman forces or whatever that they took. So, but nonetheless, could be interesting, and I think that would probably be just a great overall expansion for the game. But it would just be something that Warlord I think would have to dedicate to. But model-wise, certainly just having units of like just crazy and badass looking gladiators to field I think would be really interesting. And again, having some sort of scavenging system where your troops can basically upgrade things that they, or upgrade themselves as they survive throughout the battle would be interesting to look at there. So let us know what you guys think about that one, but I think overall that could be interesting for the game. Alright guys, you've made it to the end, and our number one faction that we would love to see in SPQR is a no-brainer, and that would be Carthage. And for whatever reason, there's just this curious gap of focus on this with Warlord. And whether it be in Hail Caesar, even though they do have lists in Hail Caesar, but it's just very conspicuous by its absence in something like SPQR. So specifically model-wise, there's no like dedicated Carthage models in Warlord's inventory, at least currently. Now, of course, again, you can make the argument, sure, you can kit bash here and there to get that, but that's not necessarily the point at all. And this would be one where like Victrix certainly makes gorgeous Carthage models, and already represents a sort of a lot of what you could realistically want to field with Carthage. But on the hero side, we'd obviously have Hannibal and like Hamilcar, maybe going back a little bit further, some of the earlier leaders there as well. Army wise, we'd have interesting influences there from sort of the African theater. So like inbuilt maybe mercenaries as like various Numidians and stuff like that, or other tribal African things there. Could be interesting to incorporate Iberians somehow into the list, or Gaul or whatever as well. But having the elephants there certainly, and in some ways unit types being somewhat similar maybe to like hoplites, but you have the different citizen soldiers of Carthage and all the various troops and stuff there. But again, would just serve as a really wonderful and I think diverse faction that deserves its own model range, A, for Warlord, but B, certainly game-wise, what it could offer as a nice counterpoint to the Romans would be great there. And whether it's just introducing it as a faction, or I think it'd probably even be deserving as a true expansion of the game. So like just Punic Wars as an expansion overall. Could obviously add new things to Republican Roman lists, but then obviously all the things that Carthage could do there, and be certainly probably make for some interesting new talents and other things, special rules for the heroes, and so on and so forth. And again, would really help sort of fill in that and present a more full picture of the ancient world here, as opposed to, again, just you know, you got Greeks, Romans, and Gauls essentially is like the poster things for like Hail Caesar and SPQR by and large. With, again, Rome and Gaul, just, you know, like that's like seemingly every time there's like a starter set or something like that, it's just always that. And I get Warlord, you know, obviously has a lot of those models, but on the other hand, again, something just conspicuous by their absence. And, you know, I would certainly make a strong case for Carthage needs to be represented in some way, shape, or form here. And again, really should be a powerhouse list to sort of contend with Rome as far as like the various power levels of the game. So again, should be a very strong faction, but certainly have some weaknesses as well. But that would certainly, again, take some solid dedication there, and wouldn't necessarily be the easiest one to bring to life if Warlord wanted to support that with, you know, not just full-on rules and all that, but a nice set of models and so on and so forth to really represent that. And, you know, you shouldn't necessarily have to buy other models or from competing companies just to have models for your faction, but obviously right now the faction doesn't even exist, so those are kind of like two things going on there. But yeah, I think Carthage overall, from all the things that we've talked about here, would certainly be, I think, the single biggest missing piece right now overall for SPQR, and I think would really offer some interesting tactics there, and just as a nice, again, counterpoint to Rome. And really, you know, with the second edition of the game on the horizon, but potential other expansions, it would be great to like have maybe some other sort of themed starter sets for the game. So, you know, you can keep your Rome and Gaul one, but, you know, having like a Rome versus Carthage one would be probably pretty awesome. And just, you know, other things like that, you know, like an Athens versus Sparta one. Just, there's so many possibilities and so much more that could be done with the game right now. But again, it's kind of sitting on the back corner and other with other issues and stuff. But those are topics, again, to jump into in a little bit, other videos that we'll be getting to in the near future here. But let us know overall what you guys thought of our list. And again, there's many others that we could add on there. And we probably will do kind of like a follow-up to this at some point. And it just really depends on how wide and diverse SPQR, I guess, wants to get with its factions. But, you know, we can certainly have like the Parthian and Bactrian, the Parthian Empire, Bactrian kingdoms, so on and so forth. So it just depends on, I guess, how far geographically and temporally the game wants to reach. But you know, some of the ones we listed here certainly are probably more deserving than others, and we might need to reorder the list a little bit. But and some might be more of a case for like just expanding the mercenary offerings that exist, or potentially growing some of those mercenary factions into more fully realized factions, while still offering, you know, them as mercenary choices as well. So let us know what you guys think in the comments. Which factions would you like to see for the game? What else would you just like to see, period, for the game? You know, again, we don't know too much yet about the second edition coming out, so hopefully that will fix some of the things that were going on in the first edition. But certainly model-wise, there's just so many things I think that Warlord could do to just sort of inject some life and energy into the Ancients wargaming scene, whether it be for Hail Caesar and or SPQR. But, you know, like games like Bolt Action have kind of had this ecosystem built around them now with all the other sub-games there of, you know, like you got Cruel Seas, you got Victory at Sea, Blood Red Sky. So there's like this whole ecosystem of other things you can do there, whereas you know, Hail Caesar finally got SPQR, but then like there's just other things that have been sort of taking away from the limelight of that, and not enough content out there for SPQR. So I think something like that could really juice up some of these potential releases here. Could really juice up the game and really make it an interesting casual game on the campaign side, but also, you know, with some tightening up of some of the rules and balance, could also be an interesting competitive game too, without having to collect and deploy, you know, hundreds and hundreds of models and play something you know, large scale like Hail Caesar. So, you know, on the sort of skirmish side, that's really an area I think that could deserve some focus. So let us again know what you guys think in the comments. Drop us a like if you could. Subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks so much for stopping by, guys. Really do appreciate each and every one of you, and we'll see you in the next one.